Hello there, and welcome back to the channel. Mad Mike here, and today we're going to be doing another director's commentary on one of my personal favorite directors, Stanley Kubrick. But before we get into that, I would just like to say at the beginning of this, I'm a comic book fan. I'm a pretty big comic book fan. I don't buy regularly, unfortunately, because I do not have a comic book store nearby, but I do own a lot of omnibuses, and I own a lot of both Marvel and DC and independent comic books and Comicscape books that have been coming out. And I'd like to turn the attention to a little book called Hero that is currently on Indiegogo. And it has 21 days left, and it is about $8,000 short of its goal. But we're going to try and get this thing to get funded. So I'm going to leave the link in the description. If you want to go and look at it, it's mainly aimed for the younger crowd. So I mean, if you want to buy it for your kids or grandkids or nephew or something like that, it sounds like it would be something, or nephew or niece, it would be something that would be perfect for them. So by all means, go over there and take a look at that. And if you think that you want to buy it, then pick up a copy, because it is a product that is worth your money. Now that we are past that, I'd like to dive into Stanley Kubrick. And really, Kubrick he is almost an anomaly when it comes to directors. There are very few directors that you could ever put on Stanley Kubrick's level. And that is, if you had a Mount Rushmore of film directors, he would definitely be on it. 100%, and I don't think anybody would really disagree with that, given the gravity of the films that he made. And Stanley Kubrick really started out as a photographer for the most part. His first love was photography, and that shows a lot in his films, where he has, even though Kubrick's films do differ from film to film, there are certain things that are constants, and one of them is these very long tracking shots that you see in the films, where there's really no music, there's just ambient noise. There's usually one or no people in the actual frame during these shots, and they can last for minutes. But it gives you a kind of it makes the environment seem a lot larger than what it might be. It makes it seem like you're in a very big place. It doesn't make you feel confined. But it's a hallmark of his, and it works very well with his movies, because not only does the shot itself make you kind of feel like you're in the middle of this huge room, but the lack of music or any kind of sound, just silence for the most part, is just very, very kind of offsetting when you're watching it. It makes you a little uncomfortable when you're in there, and that works very well for a lot of his movies, where he wants you to feel that way. But to move past, kind of his things as a director, because he was so into photography, he started getting into films not long after into his youth. And when he was, his first film, his actual film, is a little movie called Fear and Desire. Now, Fear and Desire was a low-budget film. It was filmed for 5 weeks in California. And it's basically supposed to be about these soldiers that get caught behind enemy lines, and they have to kind of figure out what's going on and try to survive. And there's this a major plot about this young soldier who finds this girl in the woods, and he winds up like tying her up and like holding her hostage, and a bunch of other very kind of strange things. But ultimately, the idea of this movie is him exploring kind of the human nature of our baser instincts. Because these are in a lot of cases, the soldiers in Fear and Desire are people that have been kind of reduced to their basic instincts, the instinct of lust, the instinct of survival, and it really does show in the film. And it was made for relatively low budget. I think there were only like 12 or 13 actors that were on the set, maybe less than that, and there were the crew was very minimal as well, and Kubrick himself did most of the work. And originally he actually planned on making it a silent film, but he did wind up adding sound and sound effects later on. But Fear and Desire is really what kind of got him noticed at first, and then he started coming together with other producers who liked him. And he lived in New York, which was a huge movie and production hub at the time, and it still is kind of now, not as much as Hollywood, but He then got into doing some other movies. He started out doing a lot of films that involved kind of mystery and noir, that kind of thing. It's similar with his next two films, with Killer's Kiss and The Killing, which were films that really relied a lot on kind of the ambiance and mystery. And again, that would be something that he would kind of play up in a lot of later films, where you would see it kind of in The Shining of he confuses the audience, but not in a bad way, in the sense that they don't necessarily know where things are going to go. But skipping past those two, there's also his big debut film, which is the film that kind of put him on the Hollywood map. Was Spartacus with Kirk Douglas. Now, Spartacus is a film that you wouldn't necessarily attribute it to Kubrick, because it was very early in his career, and it kind of didn't have that style that you would associate with him. You associate it more with a big Hollywood blockbuster, and that's really what it was, and that's what it was meant to be. And then you had the Spartacus being played by Kirk Douglas, and obviously you have the famous scene at the end where I'm Spartacus, all of them say that they're Spartacus so that they don't kill Kirk Douglas's character, because nobody knows what he looks like. But the thing is that Kubrick really, that was the film that made people pay attention to him, and that was really what he needed at that time, because he wasn't getting these big deals. Hollywood studios weren't looking, they weren't looking to Stanley Kubrick, and he wasn't a huge filmmaker at the time. But it was kind of one of those things that the movie blew up. It made a ton of money. At one point, I believe it was actually the most expensive film ever made. I don't remember which film eclipsed that eventually, but ultimately, Spartacus is a great film, and I think you should watch it. But skipping past that, you then go into what was his two collaborations with actor Peter Sellers, who many people would remember as the original Pink Panther. From, I believe those movies came out in the late 60s, early 70s for the most part. But he then did the movie Lolita with Peter Sellers, which is kind of a messed up, fucked up movie. It goes kind of hand in hand with a similar thing like Eyes Wide Shut, where it's about Peter Sellers plays a character who is an older man who is in love with a teenage girl, or he has a fascination with her, and it's kind of about how their relationship develops. It's very, very weird and cringy. It's again, it was the 1960s, so some things like that were a bit more acceptable back then in terms of a film attitude, and this wasn't necessarily something that was played up for laughs, even though Peter Sellers is generally a comedy actor. I personally find that film cringy, and I wouldn't put it in his top films at all. But really, that kind of ended what I would consider to be Kubrick's amateurish stage, or his stage where he was kind of finding his directing prowess. Because if you look at the films that came after it in rapid succession, almost all the films that came after it, he really found his style, and he found out what he wanted to do. And when you see these films, you can watch them and you recognize them as Kubrick. You can recognize that directing style. And that's really what he perfected in a lot of those early films that we then see drawn out later on. And the first film after Lolita that he did, which is his second and I believe was his final collaboration with Peter Sellers, which was the classic 1964 Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. And this film was a bit of an interesting development. Now, it went through a kind of a strange development cycle. It was filmed, and then it went through 8 months of post-production. And a lot of that had to do with some of the special effects, the stuff that they needed to do, because the whole film was about a base commander going insane and sending all of his nuclear bombers to go bomb Russia. And then you follow a few different fronts. You follow the crazed general and his second in command, who is an RAF pilot, who's played by Peter Sellers, and their interactions on the base while the army is trying to break in. You follow the crew of the bomber itself, the one that winds up dropping the bomb at the end of the film, where the pilot, Major King Kong, is played by Slim Pickens, and actually the bombardier is played by a young James Earl Jones. And then you have the third plot line is Peter Sellers again as the president of the United States, and his one of his generals, mainly following one of his Air Force generals, Buck Turgidson, played by George C. Scott in an early role. Now, this is where we kind of see an idea where Stanley Kubrick did not always he was not always very cooperative with many of his actors. Stanley Kubrick was really a very strict director, and he wanted what he wanted. He very rarely let actors kind of ad lib or like do anything by themselves. He wanted something specific, and he was going to get that specific thing. Come hell or high water for him. And he had a lot of clashes on this film with George C. Scott, which led to a personal falling out between the two afterwards, where George C. Scott wanted to play the character more deadpan. He wanted to play him more serious. And Stanley Kubrick wanted him to kind of be over the top in the sense that, his actions were very sensationalized. And ultimately, Stanley Kubrick kind of tricked George C. Scott into filming all of these he would film the all of these like practice takes almost, or what he called practice takes, where George C. Scott would be kind of he would be kind of over the top, and they would really be going through the lines, and some of it would be outtakes and stuff, and then they would film like a serious one. But in reality, Kubrick was using the more silly takes and putting them into the film as opposed to the more deadpan ones. And when Scott found out about this, he was very angry, even though he really couldn't do anything about it at that point because of contractual obligations. So that was kind of the first step, and there have been other people over time that have kind of had clashes with Kubrick on sets and the way that he chooses to direct. But for the most part, he chooses actors and actresses that generally kind of go along with his vision, and they kind of after Dr. Strangelove, people kind of knew what they were getting into when they went into a Kubrick film. It wasn't necessarily a situation where people were going in and they didn't know like how he was going to do stuff and stuff like that. People kind of knew after that just what he did, but he still made amazing films and got great actors to be in them after that, despite that fact. And Dr. Strangelove also went through a few other edits because at the time Strangelove was made, the Kennedy assassination had happened in late 1963, and they had just wrapped filming. The film, I believe, came out in April or May of 1964, but because of there were two specific things that were edited out of the final theatrical cut of Dr. Strangelove. Now, one of them is there's a scene where Slim Pickens and the crew of the bomber are looking through this survival kit they have, and at the end of it all, Slim Pickens just goes, "Oh, you can have a lot of fun in Vegas with all that stuff," but you can kind of tell that the Vegas line doesn't exactly fit his mouth in the scene, and he originally actually said Dallas, but because Dallas was the city where JFK was assassinated, they decided to remove that and replace it with Vegas. And then the second part was an entire scene that was supposed to take place at the end of the film in the war room with George C. Scott and Peter Sellers and all the other people that were down there, where they are supposed to be they have a pie fight at the end of the movie, which really doesn't fit very well with the tone of the film for that scene. The way that they end it in the actual film is much better. But they have a pie fight, and Peter Sellers, as the president, gets hit in the face with a pie and goes down. And George C. Scott screams out, "Our young president has been cut down in the prime of life," as Peter Sellers lands on the ground with a pie in his face. Now, obviously, that was cut for very because they don't want it. The president, which is assassinated, 3 or 4 months prior, so they obviously don't want that to be a thing. But other than those two cuts, the theatrical version was essentially entirely what Kubrick's view of the film wanted. It is an amazing comedy, and it is one of those comedies that if you watch it multiple times, you will find things you didn't find the first time. And there's a lot of stuff in it that I've found over the years. I've probably seen the film over 20 times. And every time I watch it, I find a little thing that I didn't see before. And there's one actually particular funny one that's a real thing, apparently, where they have a scene where George C. Scott is sitting at the war table in the war room with the president and a bunch of other people, and there's the camera angle that they have for him is the camera is almost sitting on the table and tilted up at him, so you're kind of like almost looking at him from below as he's sitting at the table, and he's just jamming like gum in his mouth. He has a huge wad of gum in his cheek that he's just chewing, probably destroying his jaw. But if you look down in the HD cuts of the film, you can actually see that there are binders that are in front of him, and one of them says "World Targets in Mega Deaths," and I don't know, that just struck me kind of funny. I'm pretty sure that's an actual term that gets used, that was used at the time when they were afraid that nuclear bombs were going to be dropped. But it's kind of a funny little add-on in there. And if you're familiar with American history and what was going on at the time in 1964, you just kind of get more of the jokes because it is very pertinent to the time it was made. But enough about Dr. Strangelove, because now we're going to move into what was Kubrick's English phase. And I say English because in 1965, Kubrick moved from New York City to England. And there was a famous line by Kubrick that was kind of interesting, where Kubrick said that he'd always tried to get certain films made, and he had kind of been not blackballed, but he had always been kind of pressured by studios and stuff like that. And his idea, what he would say later on is, if you go to them, they'll never talk to you. If you leave them alone and go somewhere else, they'll come to you. And that idea really happened to him when he was in England. And basically what happened is he moved to England in 1965, and then he immediately began began planning out his next big film, which was 2001: A Space Odyssey, that came out in 1968. Now, this film, again, it had a 5-year development cycle. He worked with on the screenplay. He worked with a famous science fiction writer, I believe it was not Isaac Asimov. I don't know why I can't remember Arthur C. Clarke. That's who it was. And Arthur C. Clarke actually wrote the novelization of it after they had written the screenplay together. But 2001: A Space Odyssey is considered to be many Kubrick's best film, and it is also considered by many to be one of, if not the greatest science fiction film ever made. Now, I wouldn't personally make that credit, because there are certain science fiction films that I would consider to be more, from an objective point of view, to be more influential, and maybe not from a film or a stylistic standpoint, but definitely more influential than 2001. But 2001, if you didn't have a 2001, you wouldn't have had a Star Wars. You probably wouldn't have had the Star Trek movies. You wouldn't have had a lot of what would be considered the great space operas of the time. And 2001 is a very interesting movie in that it has a lot of different elements in it. It has horror elements, which you would see him dive into later on with films like A Clockwork Orange and The Shining. But at the same time, it also has this kind of fantastical element. There's a lot of a very nuanced kind of interesting stuff, especially with the ending. And the ending, the metaphysical stuff in that film is so bizarre when you watch it the first time, that you have to remember that a lot of the visuals in the film are essentially metaphorical. They're not meant to be taken in the literal sense. At the end of the film, they always talk about the star baby, and the guy that when he transforms into like the highest form of life and stuff like that. But he really did something with that film where audiences did not understand it at the time. I will say that plainly, that many audiences did not understand 2001: A Space Odyssey at the time, and it suffered from that because audiences couldn't get it. But after a while, after it had been dissected, it really, really became a film that people loved, and I personally love it. I have it on Blu-ray. Actually, I have most of his films, but 2001 is what really kind of set people off, in the sense that this guy is doing something different. He's doing something different than everybody else, and he's on a whole other level than everybody else in Hollywood. And it made so much of an impact on popular culture after that point, where people it was near the end, or it was right around the death of what we would consider the Western, the American Western, which had been going strong since the 30s. And that was the 2001 was really the film that kind of transitioned us into the science fiction phase, which lasted through the late 60s, through the 70s, and into the 80s and 90s. where it science fiction and fantasy was really what captured American audiences over westerns, and you saw far fewer westerns made in the 70s as opposed to the 60s and the 50s and the 40s and 30s. Um, so then we move past 2001 and we go into his follow-up film to that, which was 3 years later, which was A Clockwork Orange. Now, A Clockwork Orange is possibly one of the movies. It has one of the most horrifying, and I don't say horrifying in terms of something that's going to make you afraid, but horrifying in terms of the implications and the subtleties of the things that are going on in the scene. And this was also one of the things that I believe was, if I remember correctly, it was ad-libbed by Malcolm McDowell, playing the lead character in Clockwork Orange, where he there is a scene in the film that has become infamous, where Malcolm McDowell and his gang of guys, they go out into the country and they break into this guy's house. He's an older guy, but he has a younger wife who's roughly around the same age as Malcolm McDowell, and they then proceed to do this very gratuitous rape scene that has Malcolm McDowell cutting the clothing off of this woman and then dropping his pants and then proceeding to rape her. And it is a horrifying scene, but what makes it even weirder is that Malcolm McDowell, playing the character of Alex, is singing in the rain while he's performing this disturbing, heinous act on somebody else. And that's really what makes that scene offsetting, is there's no music. They don't play music. It's not like a dun dun dun. There's nothing like that. It's just Malcolm McDowell singing this song while he's cutting off her clothes with a pair of scissors and then dropping his pants and disrobing and getting ready to rape her. And it's horrifying when you watch it, because you don't really get it at first, and especially if you're desensitized to violence and stuff like that, kind of like I am with slasher movies. Like, I could sit down and watch a slasher movie and be fine, but when you kind of get the implication of what you're watching and you kind of understand it, because the thing is, the song "Singing in the Rain" is all about how great it is to fall in love, and they're using it to essentially score put a musical score on a rape scene, which is entirely messed up, but it makes complete and perfect sense. And it makes sense from the point of view that that's what Kubrick wants you to feel. He wants you to feel horrified in that scene. He wants you to feel that Alex, the character of Alex, is so messed up, is so screwed, and is so addicted to doing violent and horrible things that he just takes such pleasure in it, that he's singing this song about how great it is to fall in love while he's doing something extremely heinous, one of the most heinous acts that anybody can commit. But the entire movie is about the repression of violence in society, because the entire idea is that Alex is such a violent human being that he needs to be reprogrammed in order to not be violent. But ultimately, it doesn't work, which is why by the end of the film, Alex is basically back to square one where he was before, despite all this effort to try and curb his violent tendencies. And the idea that it's the simple idea that human beings differentiate themselves from animals because they think that, we have free will to do what we want, in terms of we have the will to say no. We have the will to say no, I'm not going to be we have the will to resist our animalistic urges, whereas animals do not. And really, that's just a facade to say that we're not animals. But when you boil us down, when you cut all the civilization and everything else away, that's really what we are. And it's an amazing message to a film. And to watch A Clockwork Orange is just it's an experience that I wouldn't say Clockwork Orange is a film I enjoy, but it's not a film that I can watch endlessly. And that's the reason why, is because it has such a hard message that is so very, very true. And then we're going to move up. We're going to move up to 1980 after that with The Shining and Jack Nicholson. And The Shining is, again, it is a gem. I love The Shining. It is based off the Stephen King novel of the same name. And you see again what Kubrick does best is basically, you know, providing you with this weird kind of creepy and off-center atmosphere that is terrible. And when I say terrible, I mean in the sense that you are terrified for this family the second they walk into that hotel. And you kind of can already see cracks in the family. You kind of can already see that there's some issues there. They have issues with Jack Nicholson's character, who's a writer, and he gets hired to take care of this hotel for the wintertime, and the only ones that are going to be there is Jack Nicholson, his wife, and his son. And they establish that the son has the mental powers and stuff like that. But really, Jack Nicholson is the center of this film, and he does a great job of kind of emphasizing what happens to that character. And I know Stephen King doesn't like this movie. He thinks that it cut far too much out of the novelization that he wrote. But again, it's one of those things. Kubrick is going to make something his way. He's not going to make something somebody else's way just because they want him to. And I think that the film turned out perfectly, where you have some of these great moments that everybody remembers. Everybody remembers the two little girls in the fucking hallway. Everybody remembers that scene. You can't tell me that if you've ever seen The Shining, you can't tell me you don't remember that damn scene, because it is creepy and it is messed up. The elevator full of blood, the all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy scene. Here's Johnny. I mean, there are so many iconic scenes just from that one movie that you can pull out of Kubrick's filmography, and it is amazing. It is an amazing film, and if you haven't seen it and you are a horror fan, go watch it. Because it's probably the best Stephen King adaptation that's ever been done in terms of just adapting his work to screen. Maybe not a faithful adaptation, but just in terms of turning Stephen King's work into a screened film. And it is one of the peaks of Kubrick. And I'm not going to harp on The Shining for too long because a lot of people have seen that movie, but I'm going to move on to another. Ironically, I'm going to move on to another movie that many people have seen, which is Full Metal Jacket. Now, Full Metal Jacket, recently R. Lee Ermey passed away, who's the drill instructor in that film. You also have Vincent D'Onofrio, who plays the Private Pyle. Who really, honestly, Vincent D'Onofrio kind of steals the early show when it comes to Full Metal Jacket. And Full Metal Jacket is, again, kind of a message about human violence. It was Kubrick's, even though Full Metal Jacket really doesn't have a whole lot to do with how reality was when it came to the Vietnam War, it was still a very interesting look into what would be a violent psyche. It runs on similar lines to A Clockwork Orange, except it doesn't hammer you over the head with it as much. And it's really just a film that you watch it and you kind of sit down and you're like, what the hell did I just sit through? And not in a bad way, because it's one of those films. The interactions specifically between Vincent D'Onofrio and R. Lee Ermey are amazing. And R. Lee Ermey, the crap that he says in that movie, and again, I say that Stanley Kubrick really, he really liked things his way, and he didn't let actors ad-lib a lot. He really was kind of out of his element with how to write the drill instructor, Sergeant Hartman, and he just let R. Lee Ermey do what he did, because R. Lee Ermey was a drill instructor during the Vietnam War. So he knew how to talk to people, or he knew what he was going to say. So he ad-libbed every single one of his lines, and it is completely fucking amazing. It's a great model. His monologues in that film are legendary, because nobody else was able to kind of capture that, mainly just because he actually did it in real life. But it was one of those things that you always remember from that movie is some of the crap that he said. And I'm not going to repeat any of it, because I damn well know this video is going to get flagged if I do. But if you wanted to look up a compilation on YouTube, you would probably get a dozen of them that would pop up in a second. But, even though Matthew Modine as Private Joker is supposed to be the head character of the film are supposed to be your kind of your protagonist, Arlie Ermy and Vincent D'Onofrio steal that show, especially at the end of the basic training segment when Vincent D'Onofrio kills Arlie Ermy and then shoots himself through the head. I mean, it's so fucked up. Because the whole time that Arlie Ermy is just wearing this guy down and wearing him down and wearing him down and wearing him down over the course of the first 20 minutes to an hour of the movie, and at the end it just boils right over, and then you just see him snap and go completely fucking insane. And it's kind of one of those ideas like when people are pushed to the breaking point, what will they do? And that's kind of the message of the movie, is like, what happens when you push when you push soldiers to the breaking point? And that's really what Full Metal Jacket is about. You know, it even says it with the trailer. You know, you have the Vietnam era helmet that has "Born to Kill" on it, and you know, all the stuff. It has the peace symbol tattooed on there, like it is the '60s, and then the bullets. It's supposed to be kind of this strange contradiction of, you had in the '60s, you had this hippie culture, and then on the other side of it, you had these young men that were going to Vietnam, and they were drafted, and they had to go fight in this foreign war. But it's an interesting contrast for that film. And for America at the time in general, even though this film was made in 1987, well after the Vietnam War had ended, and the historical accuracy of it is slim to nil. It's more the message than it is anything else. But now I'm going to move on to what was his final film, and his final film was a movie called Eyes Wide Shut. And this is kind of the black sheep, I would kind of say, of Kubrick's career. And when I say that, I mean it in the sense that Stanley Kubrick he basically retired from directing after 1987. He didn't really do a whole lot. And then you had him get involved with Eyes Wide Shut, which had Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, which they both they were married after that movie. I think they were married after the movie, not before the movie came out. But the film itself, you know, everybody said, "Oh, it's just artsy porn" or something like that, because but it's really, again, it's kind of that same idea that he had in Clockwork Orange, except they put it on a much softer note of that idea of lust, that kind of idea of human sexuality, and the idea of just pure sexuality, pure sexual urges, because and it has the justifiably famous scene of Tom Cruise when he's in the mask and he's walking through the mansion. And he just sees like all these people. They're all in masks and they're all screwing each other. And the idea of it is supposed to be there's no emotional connection between these people at all. This is not making love. This is fucking. And that's kind of the idea, is that you know, can you separate yourself and just be an animal? Just be an animal and just fuck for procreation. Well, not procreation, but just screw, and that's it. And not have any kind of emotional attachment to what, because the whole romanticized idea of the films or of movies in general is the idea like, oh, well, if two characters are having sex, then there's some kind of an emotional attachment. In this film, there's really not much of one that they try to establish early on. And the message is that, you know, eventually it's the idea that, you know, if you have two ships kind of passing in the night in the sense of like a one-night stand or something like that, or just a fling where two people aren't really connected at all, then the feelings will fade. But it's the idea of, if you keep doing these things over and over again, eventually you will develop an emotional attachment to that person that you have been intimate with. And it's just because that there are certain things in human nature that are attached to that. And I'm not going to go too much into Eyes Wide Shut, but Eyes Wide Shut was Kubrick's last film. He died I believe very shortly after the release of the film. And Kubrick himself, unfortunately, he wanted to do another film that was called AI, which his good friend Steven Spielberg wound up making in 2001. And unfortunately, that film did not do very well. It was Spielberg trying to imitate Kubrick, which did not work itself out very well. And I'm not going to go too much over that, because it was really only Kubrick's film in Steven Spielberg's rendition of it, as opposed to anything else. But for all intents and purposes, I believe Eyes Wide Shut is his final film. And when you look back at Stanley Kubrick's filmography and the films he did, now he didn't direct that many films. He only directed, in terms of theatrical films, it was only about 13, and some of those were short films and stuff like that. But of his major filmography, of those 13 films, it's the idea of quantity over quality, or quality over quantity, where even though he directed some of those films, most of those films are some of the most influential films that have ever been made. You know, you look back at the stretch he had. He has Doctor Strangelove, 2001, Clockwork Orange, Shining, Full Metal Jacket. When you go through all of those films, it's like, holy crap. Even though it was a time frame from 1964 to 1987, it was over 20 years. Those films impacted entire generations of people in various ways, and that's why Kubrick is remembered as such a great filmmaker, because he was not just going to go out and make a mindless film, and he would never lower himself to do something like that. He wasn't like a Michael Bay or a Uwe Boll or something. Well, I should say Uwe Boll. I shouldn't even bring him up in this video. That's kind of insulting to Stanley Kubrick. But you know, he's not like a Michael Bay or a Zack Snyder or somebody who's going to make a film for fun. Kubrick was somebody who, if a film didn't have a message, if a film didn't have meaning, what he believed to be true meaning, then there wasn't any reason to make that film, especially later on, and especially through the middle and later parts of his career. And that, again, that's something that really set him apart from a lot of directors who were just doing it as like a job. He was doing this as, you know, it was his job to do it, and he loved doing it. But at the same time, if he couldn't make, I don't want to say make a statement, but if he couldn't make a film that had a relevant message, or had a message that related to the base form of humanity, then he didn't really pay much attention to those films, and he didn't make them. And you can see that evident in his filmography. And ultimately, I would say of Stanley Kubrick is he was by far one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And if you haven't seen a Kubrick film, go find one. Go watch one. I'm sure there's one on demand. I'm sure there's one on Netflix. I'm sure you can find one of his films somewhere, anywhere. Just sit down and watch it and enjoy it and take it in for what it is and pay attention. That's the one thing I can say is during a Kubrick film is pay attention. Because if you're not paying attention, you can miss a lot in a Stanley Kubrick movie. And it's to your benefit to pay attention to it. And with that, I'd like to close this video and thank you all for listening. Remember, leave in the comment section anything you think about Stanley Kubrick and any of these films that you haven't seen that maybe you want to see, or any of these films that maybe you have seen and you have differing views on than me. Leave a like on the video, hit the bell for notifications, subscribe, and remember, I live my life free of compromise. Do you?